Okay, so Cade, if you'd like to get us started by talking about your thoughts on LaRouche's writing on Rerum Novarum, which is the opening to Science of Christian Economy. It's the introduction, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And the writing itself is on, I think it's Pope Leo the 13th's epistle Rerum Novarum, which we can relate back to this question which we're talking about when it comes to the law of the state or the law of man. What is that grounded in when we're talking about the legalistic doctrines,
Yes, absolutely.
principles, which basically what Rerum Novarum is addressing is something of the labor issues going on at the time, which will also lead to our later discussions, not today, on the Maoist era. But basically his judgment on whether a law is itself lawful because it is a law, or whether there is a natural law which subtends that, which you can see how we're getting into today. And so LaRouche talking about this, I believe it's an epistle by Pope Leo, he puts a focus on the ecumenical question when doing political work, when trying to build up any sort of, especially let's say international type of organization or development. What are the certain bases of traditions that you can work with to develop in a reasonable way the potential of man and what humanity can do in science and technology. And he builds upon Nicholas of Cusa's De Pace Fide, which was a text written around, I think after certain atrocities in, was it Constantinople?
Yeah, the sacking of Constantinople, 1452, I think.
And it was on a similar question of like, what is the kind of basis with which the various traditions which do honor God can come together in a certain way. And if you'll allow me to just read this one extended quote from it, which is LaRouche on Rerum Novarum, and it's a section entitled The Ecumenical Standpoint. We propose that it is necessary but not sufficient to view the reference state of affairs from a Christian standpoint. For practical reasons, it is essential that even the Christian standpoint itself be presented here from an ecumenical standpoint, as ecumenical is typified by Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa's dialogue, De Pace Fide. Faith may read those writings it deems sacred or authoritative commentaries on such writings, or faith may read the bare book of universal nature, a book which plainly has been written directly by none other than the Creator himself. It is certain to all men and women of ecumenical goodwill that the two kinds of books, the written ones and the book of nature, cannot contradict one another. On condition that the written one be true, and that both the written and the natural one be read by means of the inner eye of true reason. So, where doctrinal writings differ, we may turn the eye of ecumenical reason to the common book of nature. Let us argue the point in the following twofold way. We emphasize, on the one side, the ecumenical notion of intelligible representation of a principle of knowledge of cause-effect in our universe, a means by which all men and women, despite differences in profession of monotheistic faith, may be brought by their own powers of reason to agreement upon a common principle of law. Second, we emphasize the importance of stressing Christian principles of Christian civilization as Christian, even within the framework of a monotheistic ecumenicism. And it's more the first thing there, I think, which we're focusing on today, where it talks about faith can conjoin in itself either on its doctrinal matters or through what's being called here the book of nature and the reason within the book of nature. And that second aspect, the book of nature or natural principle or natural law, that takes precedence over doctrinal matters in writing as well. If it doesn't conform to what can be read in the book of nature, then it is that book of nature which should take precedence, and then which can become the ground for a variety of faiths in order to work together toward a common good if they have that principled look towards what's considered here the book of nature. And I guess that would be the key question we're going into on these different interpretations of the Chinese tradition versus the Western tradition is there a principled cultural tradition within China that takes that similar look at the book of nature as something to be reasonably read.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, what we're trying to do, in fact, is to revive a conception of natural law in our own society, and that we're using this hypothesis from LaRouche, this method from LaRouche and from Nicholas of Cusa, to say that that potential, that outlook must also exist in another civilization, in this Chinese civilization, and that if we can understand China from that standpoint, then we can understand ourselves and understand principle itself. I think that you know, that's the level of mission that we have to take on. So we wanted to invite you, Mike, to give us we've read a bunch of your work, and we're interested to hear from you. How does that hypothesis about the potential of ecumenicism, how does that relate to what you find in Confucianism?
Well, let me say first on the question of whether something is a law being determined by how it conforms to a natural law, to the laws of the universe, to the idea that the very rocks do speak, that you can read the laws of the universe in the stars and the rocks in nature. That idea is just as true for how do you know in general that something is true? You know, how does one know what truth is? It's not a simple question at all. And I think one of the best ways to understand that is the way in which Leibniz looked at China when he was provided with the translations of Confucius and Mencius and the far less known Zhu Xi from the Sung Dynasty in the 12th century, but a genius who parallels both Nicholas of Cusa and Leibniz in terms of his genius and his restoring the ancient wisdom in the Chinese case of Confucius and Mencius, and in the case of Cusa, reviving the knowledge of Plato, which had been largely lost during the Dark Ages and was actually discovered by the Muslim Renaissance. But Leibniz looked at what he was being told about China, that here you had a population far larger than Europe. You had cities that were multiple times bigger than any city in Europe, London or Paris, or any city. A greater level of literacy amongst the population, a greater commitment to education amongst the children, and in generally a growing society based on improving on the standard of living of the population. So he looked at this and said, this long flow of history, which you can see in China when you read back on the history and you see how this population has developed its basic knowledge, its education developed, its infrastructure developed, capable of maintaining cities larger than anything in Europe and so forth. To Leibniz, that long wave of history represented by an extremely advanced civilization was evidence of the knowledge of truth. That a society which develops in that way must necessarily have discovered certain fundamental relationships between the way in which man governs himself, what LaRouche always called real economics, physical economics, the actual development of society and its relative potential population density. That this, therefore, to him, said, now I can begin to look for these fundamental truths in Chinese history and philosophy because I know those truths exist there. And he also said we should take the most favorable interpretation of what we see their philosophers discuss because we know that they had this success in the long term. I think as an aside, if you look at what's going on today, where the Chinese have achieved a miracle unprecedented in all of human history, just developing in 30 or 40 years one of the most, from being one of the poorest countries to being probably the biggest economy in the world, and in many, many areas of infrastructure and science and technology, by far and away the most advanced already. And yet you have these idiots in the West reflecting the British imperial view of certain people being born masters and certain people being born slaves, and not being willing to give up the idea that the Asians, like the Africans, are really slaves and should be treated that way and kept in a state of backwardness. But if you think the way Leibniz did about seeing China at that point, and then think about how we should look at China and see this miracle, 800 million people lifted out of poverty. Why do we not immediately reflect on the way the founder of our republic, because you can pretty much think of Lincoln as the founder of our republic, the way he looked at it, which was, this represents the discovery of profound fundamental truths about man and nature. And yet, what do you see? Oh, wild, hysterical lies, genocidal dictatorships, and so forth. I don't need to go into that. But then the most exciting part about that, about what Leibniz saw in China, was that as he read Confucius and Mencius, and especially, as I said, the less known Jushi from the Song dynasty in the 12th century, as he read his philosophic writings, he recognized it actually, I think, profoundly improved upon or expanded upon his own ideas about the laws of man and nature. And later, about 6 or 8 years after he studied the works of Jushi, he wrote something called the Monadology, which I think very clearly reflects the way Jushi thought. And the importance of that being that that man is, well, here we're going sort of back to Confucius and Mencius, but man is born fundamentally good. Now, what did Mencius mean by being born fundamentally good? That was that man has this unusual capacity to think, to have reason, to examine the laws of the universe. And it's through that capacity, not through his senses, but through his mind, that the fact that every human being is born with this mind and the senses, but he makes very clear that the senses cannot be trusted. They can be obscured by all kinds of outside forces. But it's only the mind that's capable of thinking. Hearing doesn't think, seeing doesn't think, but the mind thinks, and therefore it's a superior part of man. And if man follows that more noble part of his nature, then that's what makes a great man. That's basically what Mencius said. And this then became the basis upon which they fought against the more backward tendencies in China at that time.
And I did have a question there a little bit because of how you termed it as Jushi's Confucian Renaissance of sorts. And when you look at the history of China, you have the Han period prior to the Song period, and then you even get a lot of commenters talking about like the Han style of learning, and they take that as sort of the Confucian way itself. So it seems like for a good amount of people, like in name at least, that there would be they wouldn't consider it like something dead to have revived. Like I feel like some people would be wondering, where is Jushi coming in with a revival in comparison to at least the nominal Neo-Confucianism or Confucianism of that kind of Han style learning after the Qin period?
Well, the Han dynasty, I don't think it's a one-to-one parallel, but you can think of it sort of like the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was Christian, but especially in the case of the Roman Empire, the version of what they called Christianity was in fact just one of the pagan beliefs that they gave equal credit to. And in China, you had a similar kind of phenomena, somewhat in the Han Dynasty, but especially in the period between the Han Dynasty around 200 up until the time of the Sung in the 10th century, of the acceptance of various kinds of Buddhism, various kinds of Taoism, and especially the Taoists literally ruled at various times. And they came to accept what they called the three religions, where they accepted Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucius. They didn't use the word religion actually, but the three beliefs, the three outlooks that they combined, that this is the Chinese way of looking at things, which I think was really problematic throughout history. And I think it persists today to a certain extent. But what generally happened is that when, if you look at what happened in the West, Europe went through a period of decline, mass decline during the Roman Empire, and subsequent to that, the ideas of Greek philosophy were studied intensively during the Muslim Renaissance in the 9th century. And in fact, much of that study took place in Europe, in Spain, during the Andalusia period, when the Arabs took over most of Spain, and became a center of learning for all religions, all races. People from around the world would come into Baghdad, would come into Andalusia, and would study all of the great traditions. And in particular, they studied Plato. And Plato had been largely lost in Europe, the knowledge of Plato. And it was reintroduced into Europe around the time of Cusa, and Cusa's work in particular. Helga Zepp LaRouche made a major point of this after Lynn's death, that her view was that you had to look at Lynn and his restoring the great philosophies of history, of the way in which Plato was rediscovered in Europe, and by being rediscovered through Nicholas of Cusa and others, that this gave rise to this tremendous Renaissance in Europe. And it's Lynn's thinking today, restoring these ideas against the backwardness and the imperial view, which is like the Chinese legalist view or the Aristotelian view here in Western civilization, that we can and we must fight to bring about a new Renaissance, a Renaissance for all of mankind, which is what this organization is committed to. So it's in that sense that Jushi, there were Confucians during the Tang Dynasty that preceded the Song, but they were always battling against stronger Buddhist and Taoist traditions. And the Buddhists and the Taoists were fighting each other. The Taoists became, among other things, they had they were given certain conditions where they were allowed to not pay the same taxes as others because they were sort of the religious in the community. And they ended up having huge properties, estates, landed estates, a lot of fundista, and became very rich. And then at a certain point, the Taoists, when they were actually in charge, moved in and shut down these Buddhists. And it's sometimes in history portrayed as a fight against Buddhism, but it was actually a fight against the fact that the Buddhists had become the landlords of these huge estates. So that's just sort of touching on it. But this was the way in which Jushi, or actually his predecessors, I won't try to go into that, but there are several leading people who began to restore these ideas. And Jushi was sort of the culmination of about a century or more of these people going back into the period of Confucius and Mencius and restoring that kind of thinking that gave rise to Jushi, who was seen as a synthesizer of these people who had given a rebirth to that Confucian tradition.
Oh, and it's interesting to me when you bring up the becoming landlord of the Taoists in that time, because I was just thinking of if you're trying to bring these three beliefs together in an attempt at a kind of ecumenicism, I feel like this is a point where you can see a failure of that if it doesn't come back to that sort of principled reading of nature.
Well, see, I think that's critical. That's totally critical. That's the whole point of that Rerum Novarum discussion from LaRouche, because the alternative is liberal fascism. Because the alternative is to say, well, you have your opinion and I have my opinion, and we're all going to respect each other's opinions. And that is, that's absolutely.
Then your determining principle becomes something like the market, or
yeah, right.
Or that you turn a blind eye towards everything else, because at least you can have some group of people all getting rich together. But the one line in particular that's in one of your writings is the Lao Tzu poem about the consequences of banishing certain things, that I felt resonated with what you were talking about, the historical period, and really puts it in a total antagonism with what we're thinking about with the authentic Confucian tradition. The one that goes, banish wisdom, discard knowledge, and the people will be benefited 100-fold. Banish benevolence, discard righteousness, and the people will be dutiful and compassionate. Banish skill, discard profit, and thieves and robbers will disappear. And the last one I think is the real cooker. Banish learning, and there will be no more grieving.
Right. He also said that people should never leave their village. It's better for people to never to live their entire lives within their little village. This guy Needham, which we'll end up talking about, the British agent who was the profiler of the Chinese, he often would quote another poem by Lao Tzu, which said that there is no benevolence, that there's no such thing as benevolence in the world, that I think he said people are basically straw dogs, and that even Confucius was not benevolent, but he failed to give honor to the clans. That's a very rough translation. I don't recall it exactly, but this was the way in which the British were trying to say, let's honor Taoism as the best of the philosophies of the Chinese. And let me say, because it identifies how I approached my work. When I was put in prison with LaRouche, with an even longer sentence, I had not done any significant study of China. In fact, somebody joked and said, you have a 77-year sentence. Well, maybe you should do China, because that's 77 years. You should be able to get through 5,000 years of Chinese history. But I did. But I took Lynn's view of the way he looked at civilization in the West, whatever different cultures, as a battle between these two views of the world. He wanted to have an ecumenical view, but it would only be an ecumenical view with those ideas of man that recognized man as being in the image of God, as it's said in Christianity. And those that don't, like the British imperial view, who say that, like Aristotle, that some people are born masters and some slaves, that's really a rejection of the idea of a creator, a creator who is good. And in Christianity, at least, the word God really simply means good. What is the positive law that has brought about this universe and has given rise to this amazing species of man and women who are endowed, unlike any other creature, with the creative powers of mind that can participate in God's continuing creation. So the idea was a fight between that bestial view of man and that view of man, whatever its philosophic or religious structure, was the one that was representing the truthfulness that can be read in nature. Yeah. And how do you judge that? Well, you judge it over the long term. If your idea about nature ends up developing civilization, it develops your society, if it brings about progress, and he developed this term, the relative potential population density. If you create an environment in which you can have a higher population at a higher standard of living, through having more advanced forms of energy and energy flux density, by discovering those principles of nature which make it possible to use oil, coal, and then oil, and then nuclear, and eventually fusion, and so on. This idea of further further discovering those principles, which we'll never discover them all. We don't have that capacity. We can't be the creator. But by discovering those principles, we can create that kind of progress of mankind. And every era of progress has been brought about by people who thought in that way, in the West, in the East, in Africa, everywhere. That is something that can be proven historically and was always LaRouche's view of how we had to approach organizing society to have a new renaissance. So when I looked at China, I was starting from the premise that this must be true. I had read the Pace Fidei, the piece by Cusa that you just referred to in Lynn's writings, which if people listening to this don't know, I can just say very, very briefly, but that was Cusa's approach to how to create an ecumenical world, where he had a debate with a Christian, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Muslim, and a Tartar and others. And he basically said, you have your own customs, you have your own holy writings that have certain ideas, but he develops, and I won't go through it right here, but he develops the fact that in Christianity, you have this idea of the Trinity, of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, or love. And he said, this is good, this is the Christian view, but it's even better to look at this as the creator, the creation, and the act of creation, creativity.
Yes.
As the Godhead, the Son of God, and the love or the creativity which makes possible man being in the image of God. And in doing so, he basically brings everyone into agreement that that view is coherent with their understanding that there's only one truth, that there's only one God, if you call it God, or if you just say there's one truth in the universe. As long as you accept that you can't have contradictory views about how the world works, or if you see contradictions, you have a problem, and you have to come up with a higher ordered principle, which will what Cusa called the coincidence of opposites. So this was the approach I took, and that's basically what I wanted to add here, is that this is the basis on which I started to look at both the ancients and especially at the Song Dynasty and Zhu Xi's work.
Well, I'd like to, bring in Xunzi here, who was a contemporary of Mencius, and so perhaps 2 generations after Confucius, or I'm not quite sure exactly how long. But there's something, he has this whole piece that begins with the nature of man. Man's nature is bad. Man's nature is bad. And he says it over and over again and attacks Mencius for saying the opposite. But there's something seductive in the way that he writes. Not for one who has really investigated these matters, but I'll read aloud what he has to say here. Now, if the people on the streets were to submit themselves to the proper arts and practice learning, if they were to concentrate their heart and make single-minded their intentions, if they were to ponder, query, and thoroughly investigate, then if they add to this days upon days and connect to this a long period of time, if they accumulate goodness without stopping, then they will achieve spirit-like powers and understanding, and will form a triad with heaven and earth. But this depends upon the assertion that man is by nature bad and only acquires goodness through external training. He says, goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. Crooked wood must await steaming and straightening on the press frame, and only then does it become straight. Blunt metal must await honing and grinding, and only then does it become sharp. Now,
meaning that bad people can only be made good by putting them to the fire and straightening them out.
Yeah, right.
It's the punishment and reward. This is
Yes.
the the British Empire always talks about the good. We want the best for people, you understand. I mean, we have civilization here,
Yes.
after all, and
Yes.
we want to take civilization to the wogs, and we can teach them the good. And if they put their mind to it, they'll be good like us. You see? In the meantime, a lot of them don't make it, and we'll have to kill them off. But you see, that's the nature of man. Some are good, some are bad, and if they're bad, well, then you have to punish them. Perhaps you have to cull the herd a bit and get rid of some of those bad elements. So people who are serious and who study our writings, who study Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, those people, they'll be good. They'll be good subjects of the empire. But that's Sun Tzu, that's very much what the legalists and the Daoists and the legalists are very similar in outlook. They have different things they say, but it's that outlook of man which rejects the idea that it's the creative power of the mind, which every single human being has, which makes us good, which makes us in the image of God, as the Christians say.
And on that note a little bit, this might seem a little to the side, but what I keep thinking of in these kind of sections with Sun Tzu is, again, kind of the question of the rights, what the rights were for Confucius and what they become for Sun Tzu. Because, and I'll relate this back, it reads to me a lot like LaRouche's critique of mathematical formalism. Like when we're talking about sort of the principle of creativity of man in a certain way. Like it seems like for Sun Tzu, the sort of almost the spirit of the rights for Confucius gets emptied out into them just becoming these basic formal training tools for people. There's one quote here where he talks about the origin of the rights. He goes, "What is the origin of the rights? I reply, man is born with desires. If his desires are not satisfied for him, he cannot but seek some means to satisfy them himself. If there are no limits and degrees to his seeking, then he will inevitably fall to wrangling with other men. The ancient kings hated such disorder, and therefore they established ritual principles in order to curb it, to train men's desires, and to provide for their satisfaction." So it seems like in Sun Tzu's opinion, the rights themselves are exactly that, an empty formalism just to bring some sort of form to what's seen as like the anarchic desires of man. And so that's where I read, at least, where you need all this, what sounds to me like pretty sadistic terminology of steaming and grinding and shaping, which of course, the Sun Tzu will be doing for his followers, into not something for them to produce some principled development upon creation, but just to conform to some sort of formalism that can then be predictable, which I think you can see again through mathematical pedagogy and even sort of cybernetic, governing principles of the 20th century in a certain way.
Until the end of that quote you just read, which I'm not actually familiar with, but it could have been Mencius.
Right.
But Mencius's conclusion is that when people don't have their desires, he wouldn't use the word desires, but their ambitions, the things they want to achieve, when they're not met, and when they fall into error, he says, Mencius says, not that we have to enforce these rules and regulations on them, but rather it's the fault of the government. If you allow the economy to collapse so that people don't have access to a decent standard of living and food and the ability to raise their families, this is the government's fault. That this is a sign of bad government. And therefore, the solution to a period of that kind of decay is not to take individual people and say, it's the same thing we have now. We have this mass murder spree going on throughout the country over this last year. And the big debate over, what do we do? Do we go in and have a police state and try to stop it that way? Well, it's going to continue no matter what if we continue to decline into a financial and economic dark age, which is what's happening. Unless we have something like LaRouche's 4 laws implemented, restore a commitment to development and science and education and health here and around the world, then you're going to have a continuing descent into wars on the larger scale and crime and drugs and terror on the local scale. So that's the difference. I mean, Mencius also points out that people fall into crime when they're not achieving a decent life, but he blames the government and not the individual.
And that's one of my favorite quotes throughout this piece.
Yeah.
You could take it if you want to.
No, go ahead.
It very much sticks with me when he's talking about, he calls it entrapment directly, where he says,
Yeah, right.
they are only men of education who without a certain livelihood are able to maintain a fixed heart. As to the people, if they have not a certain livelihood, it follows that they will not have a fixed heart. And if they have not a fixed heart, there is nothing which they will not do in the way of self-abandonment, of moral deflection, of depravity, and of wild license. When they thus have been involved in crime to follow up and punish them, this is to entrap the people. And that's a certain approach to governing that I think is just outside of the sphere of conceptualizability in most popular discourse you see today, like this idea that it's directly a kind of entrapment when you look to punishment as your main recourse to crime, not that there is no such thing as righteous punishment, which I think was a main issue for both Confucius and Plato. They talk often about the necessity for it, but when that becomes the governing principle, this type of entrapment that occurs, I find that fascinating.
Yeah, especially if you look at education. If you deny your children access to science, the kind of excitement, for instance, when Kennedy wanted to go to the moon, and the way in which a whole generation of youth were inspired for science and technology, and when you absolutely deny them access to beauty, when they no longer are even allowed to listen to classical culture, classical music, classical art, classical poetry. And the vast, vast, vast majority of children being educated in Europe and the United States today are their music class is learning how to play drums and strum a guitar and listening to this ugly, ugly noise, which they then adopt as our culture. This is our culture, this noise, this ugliness. That's only because they've been denied access to any concept of beauty. And when you have no sense of beauty from your education, then it's exactly what Mencius said. You're going to be led off into all kinds of wild depravity, especially if you're also in an economy which is in a state of total decay and collapse.
I have another really good quote from Mencius that deals with this, because you raised the point that everything's the same until the conclusion, which it seems to me this has everything to do with the epistemology. The fact that Xunzi says that basically you can't know anything except through your senses. There's certain things that a real noble man doesn't investigate. And as a result, then you have the people who would mock a Leibniz who says that we live in the best of all possible worlds by saying, why is there such depravity then? The people are immoral, Confucius, Mencius. What are you thinking? You can't govern them with benevolence. You have to use what is I think Han says something about, Han Fei Zhe says something about how you have to try to govern the people of a chaotic age with benevolence and lenient measures is like trying to drive wild horses without rein or whip. But it has to do with the fact that there's this assertion that you can't know the nature of something other than through sense impression. And Mencius has a very interesting response to that, which I'll read briefly. The trees of Ox Mountain were once beautiful, but because it bordered on a large state, hatchets and axes besieged it. Could it remain verdant? Due to the respite it got during the day or night and the moisture of rain and dew, there were sprouts and shoots growing there, but oxen and sheep came and grazed on them. Hence, it was as if it were barren. Seeing it barren, people believed that there had never been any timber there. But could this be the nature of the mountain? When we consider what is present in people, could they truly lack the hearts of benevolence and righteousness? The way that they discard their genuine hearts is like the hatchets and axes in relation to the trees. With them besieging it day by day, can it remain beautiful? Others see that he is an animal and think that there never was any capacity there. But is this what a human is like inherently? And if you don't seek unto the nature of the universe, then you'll never seek unto the nature of man. And so you have this empiricist view of man, which is just that what you see is what you get. And that therefore the world is evil, and therefore we must use evil methods to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, this is where you get into the whole question of the modernology and Zhu Xi's idea of principle. If you want to discuss that now.
Oh, for sure, actually, because I have the quote from one of your pieces that's from Leibniz talking about Li or Zhu Xi's principle Li, and I thought that would be a good way to connect the two, especially in this comparison between Zhu Xi or Shunzi and Mencius, because just to build real quickly on the one Daniel quote, I think you can see their direct kind of comparison on whether you have this sort of principled approach to the universe or not, found both in the monadology and in Zhu Xi's work. But there's this one line from Mencius where heaven, in creating mankind, created all things according to law, such that people can grasp these laws and will love virtue. And you can compare that directly to another Shunzi quote where you vainly seek into the causes of things. Why not appropriate and enjoy what they produce? Therefore, I say, to neglect man and speculate about nature is to misunderstand the facts of the universe. And I just think here, because in a later work where you talk about the deconstructionist approach to China, you bring up one of the quotes from David Ames where he talks about how, Plato and Aristotle, you can't transpose those onto the Chinese world at all. There's no correlates, there's no analogies. But I just think of, when I hear these two quotes, I just see Raphael's painting of the School of Athens with, Mencius pointing up and Shunzi pointing down. And just to go then into this quote from Leibniz, where he sees the similarity between his two, his work and Zhu Xi's work, which I'd love to hear your take on. He says, in his writing directly about Zhu Xi, the first principle of the Chinese is called Li, that is, reason, or the foundation of all nature, the most universal reason and substance. There is nothing greater nor better than Li. It is not at all capable of divisibility as regards its being, and is the principal basis of all the essences which are and which can exist in the world. But it is also the aggregation of the most perfect multiplicity, because the being of this principle contains the essence of things as they are in their germinal state. We say as much when we teach that the ideas, the primitive grounds, the prototypes of all essences are all in God. And
it's like Plato's cave. Lao Tzu, one of the things Lao Tzu said specifically over and over again, if you read the Tao Te Ching, is that if you can't see it, you can't know it. Mm-hmm. If things are invisible, then there's no way to know them. You can only know sense, hearing, and so forth. And the quote we had a few minutes ago about Mencius, where he said, hearing and seeing don't think. They can be misguided, they can be misled. It's only the mind. And what Zhu Xi took from that, and he quotes Mencius regularly. In fact, he quotes the very poem you just quoted, which is from the book of poetry, but Mencius brings it up and then says after that poem that Confucius said about that poem that the author of this poem really understood the nature of man, because it's precisely through the ability to know the laws by which heaven created mankind. That heaven created mankind according to laws, that man is capable of understanding those laws. And that's how he comes to virtue. It's through being able to participate in the continuing creation, to understand the laws and apply them, that you become truly human and not an animal like Zhu Xi sees people as basically animals who have to be controlled with punishments and rewards. And then Zhu Xi took this idea and added something that wasn't in the Confucius and Mencius text, this idea of Li, meaning principle. it was a contribution he made, just as Cusa, for instance, made tremendous contributions to both Platonic thought, but even to Christian theology. He made discoveries in science, which he recognized that discoveries in science and discoveries in the philosophy of the universe are not separate, they're the same. That your philosophy of mind has to be the same as your philosophy of the scientific development of the universe. So he took this idea of Li and he said that what you see and what you hear is not what something is. Whether it be a thing, a hard object, or if it be a person or even some sort of action. What you see and hear is not its nature, it's not its true nature, but rather it's how that thing or that person or that action affects the universe as a whole. And he basically says, as Leibniz did in his monadology, everything affects the universe as a whole. The question of the one and the many.
Mm-hmm.
There's a one that is the one, but then all of the myriad things in the universe reflect that one lawfulness, the one God or the one creator or the one law of the universe, however you want to say that. Everything reflects that in some way, even down to its microscopic atomic character, its motion, because everything's in motion, everything is changing. Even a rock is in motion if you look at its atomic structure where things are moving, the electrons, and we don't know exactly what it looks like actually, but we know there's motion going on within atomic structures. So this always changing universe, whatever a thing really is in its nature, is how it affects the universe as a whole. Maybe not even in its lifetime, but somehow the development that's taking place in the universe is coherent. There's a coherence, even with the trillions of galaxies out there. There's a connection between what we little tiny world do here on this little tiny Earth in the midst of 2 trillion galaxies that Helga says?
Yes,
2 trillion?
yes.
2 trillion galaxies. That's, that's a concept that really is hard to get a grip on. But, here we are, this little tiny planet in a huge galaxy, which is one of 2 trillion galaxies, mind-boggling. And yet there's a connection because, in fact, to a certain extent, we here on Earth, being created in the image of God, probably will, if we do it right, be responsible for making sure that the creation continues to expand in the proper way. That we not only save Earth or save the human race, which may have to live somewhere else at some time in the future, but nonetheless that we also are capable of conceptualizing 2 trillion galaxies. There may or may not be any other species in this vast universe who can do that. We don't know, really, but it's this idea that Zhu Xi took. And actually, I think it's worth going through, if I may,
Please.
what Zhu Xi did with the Dashi, with the great learning, okay?
Yes.
Because this is what I've always thought really captured the way in which Zhu Xi transformed China and the way Leibniz and Cusa and so forth transformed Western civilization. So the Dashi is from the Book of Rites. It's the Great Learning, it's called, or the learning for adults actually is what Zhu Xi called it, because the Da in Shi is study or learning, and the Da just means big, and so it's usually called big or great learning. But he said the Da also means adults. So he said the Da Shi means learning for adults. Meaning this is what you need to know to become an adult, to get out of your childhood. And as you know, many people who are quite old are still in their childhood. Getting to be an adult is not a matter of time, but a state of mind. So this famous Dashi, the way it's usually interpreted, or even had been up to the time of Zhu Xi, was, it said, the ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue, and this was the inborn luminous virtue that Confucius and Mencius said about man. Man is born with this inborn luminous virtue, and he has to keep it unobscured. He has to let that come out through learning and so forth. But the way the Dashua went was that the ancients who wished to illustrate the inborn luminous virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered their state well. Wishing to order their state well, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they had to cultivate their person. And wishing to cultivate their person, they had to first rectify their hearts. And this is the question of the heart and mind. And then wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. And wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Okay? This was the Dashua. And they go on from there and they go in the other direction, that if you investigate things, then the knowledge becomes complete. If your knowledge becomes complete, then your thoughts become sincere. If your thoughts are sincere, your hearts will be rectified. The heart rectified, the people will be cultivated. People being cultivated, their families will be regulated, and families being regulated, the states were rightly governed. So this was this idea of the connection between the individual and the state. So Jushi said, well, there's a misinterpretation of the opening of this. The opening was the ancients who wished to illustrate their inborn luminous virtue throughout the kingdom ordered their state well. Jushi said, no, that wasn't Confucius' intention. It was that every person has to keep their inborn luminous virtue unobscured. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the ruler who wishes to illustrate his inborn luminous virtue, but rather that opening sentence should be interpreted, and this is the way Jushi sort of rewrote the interpretation, was the ancients, in order that all people keep their luminous virtue unobscured, in order to make sure that all people could keep their luminous virtue unobscured, you had to put the state in order. And then you'd go ahead and say, to get your state in order, you do this, you do this, you do this. So beyond that, first of all, he generalized this to all people, not just that the ruler has to be good, but that he has to be committed to the idea that all people have the right to be good, to keep their luminous virtue unobscured. But even more important, at the very end, where the traditional, well, not just the traditional, the actual wording in Chinese, the last thing you have to do in order for your thoughts to be sincere, you must extend to the utmost your knowledge of things. And Jushi said, well, okay, yeah, you have to increase your knowledge of all things. But what does that mean? What does it mean to have knowledge of all things? Well, it doesn't mean sensual mathematical readings. It doesn't mean measuring it to see how big it is, or what color it is, or what it tastes like. It's not a sensual issue. It's this idea of what is the principle of that thing that connects it to the one, to the universe. So he said, somehow over history, the last sentence in the Dashua was lost. But what it really said was extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of the apprehending the principle in things, not just investigation of things, but it lies in fully apprehending the principle in things. So this is very Leibnizian. This is Enkuza. It's that if all things must be coherent. If you see contradictions, then it's due to your lack of knowledge of something in the universe. And therefore you have to be able to come up what he called the coincidence of opposites, a higher principle which explains why there appear to be contradictions. And that this, of course, is just as true in ending wars. And as in the Pace Fidei, ending religious wars, ethnic wars, because there is a common principle for mankind as a whole. There is a common aims. And if we seem to be unable to reconcile our differences, it's due to the want of thinking about what the higher principles are. That was Cousé's intent. It's what LaRouche's intent always has been. And what, it's the only way we're going to get out from under this descending dark age and bring about a renaissance. So this is what Zhu Xi was doing. He was creating a renaissance. And he was drawing, as we can talk about another time, he was drawing on some of the scientists from the previous century who had given rise during the Sung dynasty, which he sort of culminated. But during that dynasty, there was a tremendous burst of scientific capacities. The development of the compass, the gunpowder, all kinds of agricultural techniques, iron making, and so forth. Things that we read about 300 and 400 years later in Europe were taking place then during the 10th, 11th century. So he's drawing on this cumulative restoration of the philosophy, which is coherent with the truth of nature and the way in which that truth was giving rise to new knowledge about nature, to new technologies, new science. And it's in this particular thing here, his transformation of the dasha into a higher ordered principle for the ordering of society and the ordering of your personal life as well as your nation or the world, the way they saw it.
Can I say that I think that in the same sense that what Cousa does is an advancement and a development of what is already implicit in Plato, but not unfolded, that you do see the same thing with Confucius, because in the Doctrine of the Mean, for example, the translation that I have includes this section. Confucius said, in terms of transforming people, sounds and appearances don't amount to much. The Book of Odes says, virtue is as light as a hair, yet even a hair possesses the great principles. In the functions of supreme heaven, there are no sounds or smells. It is perfect. So there's this.
I didn't remember that passage. That's good.
Yeah, there's clearly we have there's a realm of principle, or there's a knowledge of principle, which is a knowledge of something that does not have sense impression and is not possible to attain unto through sense certainty. And then it's really clear in the Great Learning that this is also a principle of physical economics implicitly. It's not developed, but it's there. He says, virtue is the root, wealth is the result. If he make the root his secondary object and the result his primary, he will only wrangle with his people and teach them rapine.
That's Confucius?
Yeah, that's Confucius.
There's a Mencius quote very, very much like that. That I'm not sure I can remember it exactly, but it's that there's the nobility of heaven and the nobility of man. The nobility of heaven is benevolence, righteousness, knowledge, and propriety. That's the four virtues. The nobility of man is becoming a king or a ruler. The problem these days, he says, is that people aspire to the nobility of man,
right,
without aspiring to the nobility of heaven. And if they do that, then they're going to also lose the nobility of man. And that's the mandate of heaven, right? He's basically saying, if a person aspires to be a ruler and a leader without being a virtuous person, then eventually you're going to lose the mandate of heaven. And as in the American Declaration of Independence, the people are going to reach up into heaven and pull down that righteous sword and remove you from power for failing to actually be a good ruler.
If I can extend it a little bit further in terms of the contrary outlook, I think it's quite striking that Sun Tzu, by his epistemology, it's just necessary that he's like the Chinese Adam Smith, because he says, you vainly seek into the causes of things. Why not appropriate and enjoy what they produce? Therefore, I say, to neglect, and this was what you had before, neglect man and speculate about nature is to misunderstand the facts of the universe. But then he also says, all ethics begin from the imbalance between goods available and human desires, which he already states are bad. So you have this...
the conflict between goods available and human desires?
And human desires, the imbalance between.
So that's based on, you're right, the Adam Smith idea of limited resources. We don't create resources, they're just there, and if we use them up, they're gone.
Right.
It also seems like the theory of moral sentiments is...
I hadn't thought of it that way, but that passage is exactly that concept. It completely leaves out the creativity of man to discover higher order principles of nature, which redefine what your resources are. So you never run out of resources if you're using your mind.
And then what you're referring to in terms of Zhu Xi's contribution, I mean, is the development of the concept of virtue into the investigation of this coherent principle, the predetermined harmony of the universe, perhaps. And so to be able to elevate that notion of virtue, I mean, that's a project we're engaged in right now.
Well, and one thing that I thought was interesting to maybe come back to when it was when you were mentioning Kusa's approach to, like, principled approach to contradiction, going to a higher principle when you come across contradiction. I think some of this is a more thorough discussion is maybe better left off to maybe our next conversation. But especially in contemporary in the 20th century China, the theory of contradiction, stemming from Hegel through Marx to Mao, became a huge groundwork of what their theory of praxis was and how they govern. That always came through a theory of contradiction to a certain degree. And that's even in the Neo-Confucius era now, you still see it as a prominent part of any sort of, CCP kind of edict. But what... CPC, yeah. But what strikes me with this, when you compare what you get from that Hegel to Mao theory of contradiction to the Kusa one is still the same thing about reaching to a higher principle or not. And it seems like how Zhu Xi is taken maybe in a lot of contemporary theorists from China that I've seen, he often is denounced as something of a dualist, I think, because of what I think is called a school of principle. The same way with Kusa having, if you have an imminent contradiction, that's some sort of failure of thought where you can reach up to a higher principle. It does seem like that's the same thing in what you get with Li and Zhu Xi. But it's interesting to see how there's been a sort of pragmatic turn away from that, especially in a contemporary sense, where you still are taken to have to face this contradiction, but any recourse to that kind of principle is generally seen as a metaphysical dualism of sorts. And it seems like a lot of the school of principle of Zhu Xi is somewhat fallen out of favor for something of his successors' brand of Neo-Confucianism, or something who just was after him, Wang Yangming, was something I think it's called often like the school of mind, which it seems like its epistemology does come from what it's considered a more practical interaction with the world, where like you don't have things bestowed from heaven, but then it's seen as like intertwined, which in my mind seems to have a certain sort of Taoist spiritualism to it. But that I think you see that adapted in the contemporary, where you have forsaken the idea of principle, the idea of Li, and instead you're just working through contradictions in an immanent way. And I think that might even lead us to something like the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, because what you end up getting, it seems like, is just these periodizations of history that work through contradiction without any sort of measure or order for development outside of that. You just go from kind of like one thing to the next to the other.
I don't even understand that. What on earth causes the progression? I don't know how you can have. Unless you simply assert that there is no such thing as cause, which it seems like that's way too far for even these people to say.
And what I see from this sort of tradition when it goes back to the Hegelian dialectic for the most part, where you have theories of ontological contradiction, or that's the end of it. It's something where the contradiction sort of spurs upon itself, because it's taken from like the Kantian tradition of a limited epistemology of what one can understand, that you can see in line kind of with Xunzi and Aristotle to a certain degree. But that limited understanding then for Hegel, where he gets his theory of contradiction, isn't limited compared to some total view of God or something like that, even if it's a bar view like it was for Kant. It becomes limited per se in a certain way, that the coherence of the limited view is coherent only when you disregard what he considers the contradiction of the total view. It's a very kind of, I'd almost say, virulent kind of nihilism, where contradiction is seen as the essence of what is. And so when you have coherence, that's only from something of a limited view. And there have been people who compare it sort of to a Taoist tradition in a certain way, like, and even kind of bring out some sort of philosophical quietism from it, where it's like, and that's why you shouldn't try and get like a view of the world, because essentially it goes back to contradiction. And this is earlier what I was going to say when you're talking about Jushi and Leibniz coming from Kusa, and this idea of principle in what you're talking about, the endless change of the trillions of galaxies in the universe. It seems like that's what really distincts them from something like a Taoist or a Heraclitean school of just change. And I think that's what you see today.
Well, I think it's the issue of materialism, you know, the materialists and the reductionists, the people who fundamentally, what is so-called materialism, be it dialectical materialism or any other kind of materialism? It's a rejection of any kind of metaphysics. It's a rejection of precisely what Jushi and Leibniz believed, which was that you don't know the nature of something through its material quantities. And you're completely missing where progress comes from, where development comes from. Even before life, there was development of the universe, and it's based on a principle. And Lynn has further developed those principles to this idea of energy flux density, where you have the opposite of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. Instead, you have what Lynn called sometimes non-entropy or negative entropy. That there is a lawfulness in the way in which the universe is structured, that energy tends to become more and more concentrated as the universe was developing, whether there was a beginning or not. We know the universe is continuing to develop. It developed materially through greater and greater concentrations of energy, to the point where ultimately it became possible for the evolution of chlorophyll, and you began to have life, living cells, and then plants, and then eventually man. Is this Darwinian evolution? No, that's nonsense. I think any sane person knows that that's nonsense. There's a lawfulness in the development of the universe which requires the rejection of any kind of materialist view.
Yes.
It can't exist in a material universe. The fact that we're here as a human race proves that materialism is just a complete misconception of the universe, that there are evolving principles and evolving laws. So I think really you have to get down to that fundamental question, because again, it's a question of the nature of man. If you reject the idea that the human mind uniquely puts the human race in a position of participating in this continuing creation, which itself must be negentropic, then you can't have any kind of linear laws. You have to be able to look to a higher principle of what's governing things. We still don't know what life is, I mean, there's many huge things that man hasn't figured out yet. How are we going to have matter, antimatter, energy propulsion? What is life? What makes a cell at one moment living and at one moment dead?
Yes.
You know, we don't know. These are things that require a huge further investigation, which thank God will never end, you know, because we're always going to be imperfectly discovering more and more of the nature of the laws of the universe. It's like in Christianity, they say you can't be God, but you can know God. You know, the Taoists and materialists generally say you can't know what you can't see. Well, that's just not true. And as Plato showed, in fact, what you think you know because you see it or feel it or touch it is not real knowledge at all. It's only those understandings of the principles underlying things which characterizes real knowledge. You mentioned the Wang Yangming. I'll tell the story I tell every time I write something about this. Wang Yangming considered himself a Neo-Confucian like Zhu Xi, but he questioned this idea of the principle, the Li. He was ultimately a materialist. And he said, well, I'm going to do a critical study to see if this Li really exists. So he and a friend sat down in their father's garden and they decided to look at a bamboo shoot. And they were going to keep looking at that bamboo shoot until they figured out what its principle was. So they stayed up all night and they eventually got sick and tired and they couldn't figure out what the principle of the bamboo was. The conclusion, there's no such thing as principle. And as far as the mind goes, the human mind is not a reflection of the lawfulness in the universe, but all that exists is what's in your mind. That's all there is. This is very Cartesian, you know, Descartes fake science, which comes from the same kind of principle. It's I think, therefore I am, that what is in my mind is the reality, and everything else outside, it's an existentialist view basically, and it simply rejects fundamental science, right? Which is why Leibniz was able to pick so many holes in Descartes' lousy algebra and his lousy science, because it was just predicated on a completely false notion of what characterizes the universe and the nature of man. So unfortunately, this Wang Yangming character had a huge following of pragmatists, very pragmatic, you know. I think Chiang Kai-shek's primary problem was that he was a follower of Wang Yangming, which is why I think that ultimately failed. And it's still very much a problem in not only in the West, but in Asia too. You know, this distinction between understanding this profound idea. And getting back to where we started, I think when you look at China today, and as I mentioned last week, I really have not studied contemporary philosophic writing in China. But if I were to do so, I would approach it the same way Leibniz did, that this miracle of the last 30 years, 40 years, must reflect a understanding of that concept, of the Zhu Xi concept of the principle or the monadology of Leibniz, reflected in their philosophy and also in the way in which they apply that philosophy. It certainly is obvious in the sense that they put tremendous emphasis on science education, on culture, both Chinese historical classical culture and Western classical culture. As people know, I think the Chinese produce more scientists, more engineers, and more classical musicians in the Western classical music sense than I think the rest of the world combined, but certainly a hell of a lot more than anybody in the US or any part of Europe. You know, they're totally focused on the idea of innovation, creative thinking, and a higher level of culture. And this is what we call vicious genocidal dictatorship. When you listen to Mike Pompeo or to the British. So
Well, I think this has been very, very valuable, and there's a lot more that Cade and I can develop
Sure,
between
yeah.
each other. I'd like to suggest that we conclude with a little bit of a development of the notion of Ren, of benevolence, and the coherence or the congruence of that notion with agape, as we know from Paul and from the work of LaRouche, who developed very thoroughly, especially in Science of Christian Economy, but throughout all of his work, the central question of agape, of the love of the divine, the love of mankind, the love of the development of the other, and thinking about Leibniz's discussion of on felicity. I'd like to sort of put forward my own hypothesis, which is I've been thinking about the 5 great relationships that Confucius discusses, which I don't have them totally memorized, but if I remember correctly, it's like ruler and he who is subject, father, son, husband, wife, older brother, younger brother, and friend. I think that's what they are. And he says that he puts enormous emphasis on filial piety, but clearly from the discussion of those relationships, it's about love. It's about profound love between human individuals. And I thought about, how essential this is, because actually there's another figure named Mozi, who created something called Moism, which was a reaction against Confucianism, as I understand it, in what I've read from him. And I read some of the Moist tracts, and they attack Confucius for the idea of these 5 relationships in filial piety, because they say, no, there should be undifferentiated love of all of mankind, of every human being. That's very important. How they say you can achieve that is that basically you can order people to. They said if the emperor can order people to march into a burning, castle and in order to win some military victory, then you can order people to love all of mankind.
Well, if Lycurgus could split up all the land equally, then now we get someone to split it up.
Yeah, absolutely, and oh my God, you can imagine all of the things that any tyrant might do with that content.
I think the hippies in Berkeley would agree with Mr. Mo.
Yeah, right. Free love.
Can't we just love one another?
And it's an enforced. Yeah, this is like sort of John Lennon of ancient China.
John
And
Lennon,
no
with
religion
L-E-N-I-N.
too.
So, but it seems to me that like you really, and LaRouche talks about the relationship between like the mother and the child, or the parent and the child, in terms of a way of understanding agape. It's in these relationships that you get maybe an image, maybe the essence of agape. You're able to partake of that which coincides with divine love, with the love of God. You're able to, in the same, because the tradition that we're fighting for is the conception that you can put yourself in the mind of God as best as you possibly can. And so do you need, if you're going to do that the way that Kuza did, the way that Kepler did, for example, then you also have to put yourself in that same agapic position. But you can get there, I think, I have this hypothesis, that you can get some notion of it or some access to the essence of it through these relationships. And that the understanding of the coherence of the individual, the society, humanity. And I have to go a little bit further with this, because it seems to me that kind of coherence, which we discussed in the Great Learning in Confucius and then elevated by Zhu Xi, and this idea of filial piety as I'm hypothesizing it, this is the necessary requirement for a republic. the idea that there is a coherence between the fate of the individual, the future of the individual, the good of the individual, and the public good and the good of mankind. That is an essential requirement for the republic. And then not only that, but it grants us access to that which makes all of this materialist periodicity of history so nonsensical, which is that it is the action of the sovereign individual human mind that moves all of humanity forward, that moves a society forward, that moves, a family forward, a people forward. And I see in this a real relationship to, a total requirement for the development of a republic.
I wonder if a way to put it, like to compare it to this Daoist or hippie love of everyone, if what we're talking about with Ren and Agape, if this love of everyone is an everyone that's transcendent and not, let's say, totalizing. It's not like individually, okay, make sure you've loved like every single person. You have to have like your books all lined up with all the phone number, call someone up today, tell them you love them, that sort of thing. But if the one that we're talking about here, we can relate back to LaRouche's Project A, which his solution to the one of the many is this one of creative mentation before the counting one, that sort of one that combines the macrocosm and the microcosm. And so if you're talking about loving everyone in that sense, in a transcendent sense, where it's a love, between an elder brother and a younger brother, or a ruler and a ruled, that it's loving in a way where that transcendent aspect makes itself apparent and maybe brings out of just the material relation itself. And so where you need to found the republic on a certain sort of principle that's not just the amalgamation of all the material relations, but that needs to be apparent within each individual sovereign relation as well, that you have that transcendent aspect.
Well, what you're getting at there, I think I've always sensed that Lynn's fundamental discovery implies or includes that agape and creativity are exactly the same thing.
Yes.
There's no distinction. So that to love someone doesn't mean that you say nice things about them and you always, if you love them, you're going to tell them when they're screwing up and heading for hell. And that's true for everybody, including your family. And that love is not this sort of amorphous hippie sense of getting along, but rather having a shared mission with every other human being to bring about the advancement of humanity as a whole. And the question of relationships is, it's obviously critical this, but especially the relationship within the family, because the question is, how are you going to bring up your children? That's what the relationships between brother and older brother. I guess he doesn't have sister and younger sister, does he? But it's implied. And all of these relationships reflect whether or not you're going to have a society which is well governed. You remember from the Great Learning, you have to have your family regulated first. Why? Is that because this is a hierarchical society where whatever daddy says you must do? No, It's that you have to be able to educate children to develop the creative powers of their mind and not get lost with the obscuring of their inborn luminous virtue. This is the creative power of the mind, which is unique to humanity. And that's why there's a difference between agape and love. A dog loves its children, and that's good. And people will love their children no matter what, sort of. But to really have agape is more than just that sense of love. In fact, is it Jushi? It's either Jushi or Mencius, but I think it is Jushi, who says that Ren, which is this word Ren in Chinese, R-E-N or J-E-N, which is the equivalent of agape. He says that Ren is not love, it's the principle of love. It's the principle of the universe which gives rise to our capacity to love in a way which is totally different from animals. It has to do with loving in the sense that we are sharing a mission for mankind as a whole. that we are mortal. We're going to die. We're here for a very, very brief period of time, but our ideas are eternal. And if we develop those ideas and apply them, then we contribute to the idea that mankind is eternal. You know, even if our Earth blows up 2 billion years from now, by that time, hopefully we'll be somewhere else, and that we can make humanity and any other species we discover out there that also has creative powers to be eternal. That the fact that we might not be is obviously very real. You know, we could be hit by an asteroid tomorrow and the human race would be gone. These are very real issues. And if we end up going into nuclear war, we probably wouldn't even need an asteroid, you know. But to participate with all of mankind all the time in a passionate commitment to the development of humanity as a whole, that is agape. That is something more than just love, and it's something more than same thing with the Ren idea compared to I in Chinese, which is the love that does exist between people, but it doesn't reach the level of this I, this Ren, or this agape. So this is what Lin means when he says that, you know, the development of every single child's creative powers, yes, requires that they are allowed to develop a knowledge of beauty, that they be given access to real music, to creative art, to great poetry, and science, and technology, and the philosophy of creativity. So it's that sense that we'll all be celebrating on Saturday, I think.
And I get on that note in particular, maybe it's necessary to kind of have a rectification of a name in regards to the George W. Bush policy of no child left behind.
I have a thought that follows that. Of course, we're talking about the Saturday seminar at the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. I'm not sure that we'll have this episode produced by Saturday, but you know, it'll
be recorded.
It'll be recorded. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, hey, this is big progress. First episode.
I mean, you could look up the conference on YouTube after you hear this.
That's very true. That's very true. You listen to this. Go check it out. No, but seriously, I mean, I think that the work of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, the development of Lin, when I think about the idea of the exoneration, or exactly, how do I put it? What caused me to think about LaRouche's exoneration when I was reading Confucius was in The Great Learning, in which, I mean, he develops this just beautiful outlook that that it is the virtue and the benevolence of the people and of the individual that are determining for the future of a society. And in that, you know, that is so liberating. Maybe that's not the right word, but it elevates, you know, it gives a person a sense that one's own contributions as an individual make the difference, and that the contributions that you make are not about accomplishments, but they're about the development of your own virtue or knowledge, or, as you know, Mike, we're calling this podcast Unlearned Ignorance. So the development of your learned ignorance. And I thought about this quote. He says, "From the loving example of one family, a whole state becomes loving. And from its courtesies, the whole state becomes courteous. While from the ambition and perverseness of the one man, the whole state may be led to rebellious disorder. Such is the nature of the influence. This verifies the saying, affairs may be ruined by a single sentence. A kingdom may be settled by its one man." You know, now, first of all, I think the truth of that is so large for us as Americans, because if you look at Hamilton, if you look at Franklin, if you look at Lincoln, and of course, Roosevelt and Kennedy. I mean, if you go to like the Roosevelt Museum in New Hyde Park and you take a look at the letters that people wrote about listening to his fireside chats, or if you think about the way that people related to John Kennedy and his family, but then imagine if people could come to understand the incredible depth of agape that Lyndon LaRouche represented and represents and continues to, and the way that that then you see the way that, his contributions, for example, could lift up not just our nation, but humanity.
Nobody would ever accuse Lynn of being nice to everybody. But in fact, he loved everybody. He saw that no matter how depraved some people became, they could reform themselves. It's always possible.
I think especially
when Lynn and Henry Kissinger were at the same event at one time, Bill Jones went over to Henry and said, "Henry, would you like to meet Lyndon LaRouche?" And he said that Henry looked at him with a very strange look. And he said, "Well," and they walked over and Lynn shook his hand and said, "We're from the same generation, Henry. We should sit down and talk." And he said that Henry just said, "Oh my God," and turned and walked away. But Lynn meant it, Can you imagine what would have happened if he and Henry had sat down and talked? Lynn would have been able to use Kissinger's vast but linear knowledge to expand his mind, Kissinger's mind. It would have been a fascinating discussion. And I'm sure Lynn would love to have done it if Kissinger had the courage to follow through.
Well, and that seems principally in line what he was able to do with the Reagan administration in the earlier years, at least.
Yeah, that's true.
Because I know there's varying opinions of Ronald Reagan, but it doesn't exactly become like he comes from a Hollywood background. He's got various opinions here and there, but there was at least a certain level of common sense where on the idea of nuclear armament and the SDI, you could make the case there, and he was receptive and was able to make that case. And I was thinking, especially with everything we're seeing today, with all of the negative forecasts LaRouche made of if you don't do these things, like what will happen to your economy, what will happen to the state of your physical economy when we see the pandemic, when we see financialization, when we see, on the verge of exponential inflation that we are. It seems like it is maybe the right time for, I think what I've seen Helga Zapp-LaRouche say about the additions that are coming out through the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, that if people get familiar with his work, that we'd be on the edge of a new renaissance. So we can go beyond just the negative forecasts, which have come to fruition, and start taking the sort of principled prescriptions in mind as well, and see if we can build towards that sort of productive renaissance. As we see what I think we're hypothesizing a bit that the China of today is going through because of something of a return to the authentic Confucian principles.
Yeah, good.
Okay, well, that was a lot of fun.
Yep. Good.
Absolutely.
Good. Provoking discussion. Thought-provoking discussion.
I really enjoyed reading Confucius. And there's more to read.
I am, Mike, we're so appreciative having you be able to join us here. And I very much look forward to, a future discussion, maybe focus more on the 20th century. And just to tease a little bit about it, I think maybe instead of calling it Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, we could call it Russellism, Deweyism, Maoism.
Now, I was going to say when we discussed the family, and we should certainly discuss this later. I think I mentioned when we tried to do this earlier, Russell's fundamental attack on China was against Confucianism and the family. He said China is backward because of this terrible Confucianism, and especially this idea that you have to honor your father and your brother and so forth. Family, allowing this family domination turned the country into a non-progressing, stalled, backward country. I mean, it's just straight out attack on the family. And it's like he said, if I get them young enough, I can convince them that snow is black.
You can
break up the family and you can do it. Look what's happening in America. Look at this green movement, you know.
Yeah.
99% of the youth who swallow this crap, you know. Frightening.
if you can steam them and twist them and grind them earlier enough.
Yeah, right.
Grind them up to make your bread.
Yeah.